And we are live. Hola, connoisseurs of conflict, conspiracy, carnage, and corruption. I had to look at my notes because this is a little bit of a different show.
Notes? What kind of frickin' amateur? Notes?
Notes, exactly, notes. And even did some preparation to break from our usual routine. This is Nate Wilcox of Bloody Elbow, a.k.a. Kid Nate, joined by Eugene S. Robinson, author of Fight, Everything You Ever Want to Know About Ass Kicking, but we're afraid you get your ass kicked for asking.
Nice.
This is an episode of Intrigue, our occasional show where we talk about non-cage fighting topics, and we want to apologize in advance for the horrific, abysmal, abominable, awful topic we've chosen today, World War II and the Eastern Front, from the Ukraine to Poland and Belarus.
Lithuania, or Latvia.
Yep, Lithuania, the Baltic states. We're going to be talking mostly about Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands and the Russian classic film Come and See. So, Eugene, why did we pick such a sunny topic? What is the point of studying horrific?
You know, every time clouds enter my life and I'm not feeling as happy as I might be, every time sorrow visits me, you will find me on YouTube looking at animal attack videos. And somehow this buoys my spirits, watching people killed by elephants or chased by lions, or people who thought it was a good idea to hug bears. And so it's very much in the similar of super aggressive to the nth power Schadenfreude that we are doing this show, except for this is the gross exercise of corporate government powers. So we are actually aligning ourselves, much like Tom Joad, with a little guy. Maybe.
Exactly. And there were lots of little guys.
Not really. If there's a boot kicking a face somewhere, I'll be there with my foot in that boot. Because like Bruce Willis said in Bugsy, or I'm sorry, it wasn't Bruce Willis, it was Dustin Hoffman said to Bruce Willis in Bugsy, if you had a choice between being where you are and being where I am, what would you choose? And
exactly.
Bruce Willis had his feet in buckets of concrete on the back of a boat. So, clear-cut choice for me, my friend.
Was that Bugsy or was that Ragtime?
No, it wasn't. It for sure wasn't Ragtime.
You sure? All right. Well, either way, that's the killing of Dutch Schultz's bodyguard, Bo Weinberg.
Yes, correct.
And concrete, and so.
Hey, are you sure that your name is pronounced Nate and not Nate?
Well, you call me Nate. I have answered to Nate, Nat, Nay, Nathan, and Nathaniel. So you know.
But not Nate.
Nate is new to you, but I will take it. I will not refuse to answer to that. So.
All right. So here we are.
Thoughts on, well, I want to do this sort of organized. So we did why it's worth the time. And let's go immediately just to the horrible shit. The most fucked up moment of the book and the movie. I want to go first because there's a moment in the book Bloodlands that absolutely was the most, of all the horrible things in the whole book and the movie, this to me was by far the most awful. This is during the deliberate starvation of the people of the Ukraine by Joseph Stalin, which was a deliberate policy that resulted in anywhere from 1.5 to 3.3, maybe in 3.8 million people killed by starvation, deliberately done by Stalin.
Kulaks is what he called them.
Kulaks. Initially it was kulaks, and then later they were attacking a Polish conspiracy. Yeah. But there's a moment in the book where the starvation is so bad that a worker in an orphanage recorded a moment when the kids suddenly got quiet, and she turned to see what they were doing. And they had turned on little Peter, and they were tearing strips of meat off of his flesh and eating them. And little Peter was also tearing strips of meat off his own body and eating it as fast as he could. And the other kids were attaching themselves to his bleeding wounds like vampires and sucking the blood out. Yeah. That, to me, it does not get any worse than that. I mean, Treblinka being burned alive by the Derlevanger Battalion, betrayed by Stalin, tortured by the NKVD, nothing is worse than being little Peter. I think being
that's a small story that sort of in micro encapsulates the macro horror, But a friend of mine who was actually Soviet, so he was from Georgia, so Soviet Georgia, Tbilisi, I believe. He said something interesting to me. He said, one, Stalin there's a revival, there's a revanchism on the part of people in their public consideration of whether Stalin was a good guy or a bad guy, and where they're going with this is pretty singularly that the idea that Stalin was, much like they said with Ronald Reagan, that Stalin was a good guy, but it was the people behind him. So that's the argument that they're giving in order to, to cotton to the most recent and last Georgian hero that they had outside of Shevardnadze. So, that's instructive, but you have to understand that those stories were repeated over and over and over again. You don't have to go back. I don't know. I mean, you've got kids recently, so maybe you've read the fairy tale of Baba Yaga. Do you remember this?
Yes, of course. Yeah, the Russian fairy tale.
And to me, this was a fundamental. What you've described is kind of a version or a variant of a feeding frenzy, and there's a certain mindless aspect to it by virtue of the fact that even Peter is consuming himself. Autophagy is what I think it was called. I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sure, but it was very typical for people to suffer some glimpse, some glimmer of remorse about what they were doing to eat. So they would frequently send their own kids over to relatives' house to be consumed. It's like, I couldn't possibly eat my own son, but you could, and I will trade you your son for my son or your daughter for my daughter. So it was very typical for parents to say, could you go take this over to grandma's house? And these are where the stories of Baba Yaga came from. For a long time, people thought.
And Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood. That's another way of looking at the grandma turned into the wolf.
Yeah, right. So these could be. There could be the assumption that these stories were bullshit, overblown, scare kids into bed at night. I don't know how that works functionally. Good night, kids. I don't know exactly how that works in terms of the story, but. I remember not believing it or thinking it was some sort of agitprop, and then actually seeing photos of the open-air bazaar where people had on display foodstuffs that they did not even bother to disguise as anything other than what they were, which in this instance were 9-year-old children. So I'm remembering distinctly from a book, Hitler and Stalin, not the book Bloodlands, but another book, where what happened. All right, what happened is that Stalin's wife, at some point, decided to go see for herself. Talk about come and see. Decided to go see for herself, and she went because she heard about the rumors, and she went and saw what was happening in Ukraine. Came back, told him, and he denied it. He denied it was the case, and pretty much she proceeded to have a nervous breakdown post facto. It was never quite the same.
Shot herself in the heart shortly thereafter.
Yeah, right. So, there were micro stories enough, to I mean, they were all over the place. But I think the reason why we're paying attention to it, the reason why we care, and to go back to my friend who was Soviet Georgian, who was telling me about the revival of Stalin's, the opinion of Stalin, he said something very simply to me. And this guy has now been in America for 30 some odd years. He said, you know what, Eugene, it's hard to care about one person. It's really hard to care about 1 million people.
Exactly. That's the Stalinist maxim that one death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic, which is similar to the American ethos of if you're going to be a criminal, steal big because you're going to better chances of getting away with it. And Stalin
better was it hung for sheep as well as a lamb.
Yes, it's. I don't know.
That was your people. That last one. My Irish. Better be getting hung for sheep as a lamb.
Yeah, I don't know, this topic, and it's also timely because shit is going down in the Ukraine right now. We've got neo-Nazis and Russian partisans at each other's throats in the Ukraine. NATO's back on one side, Putin's back on the other. From what I can tell, I'm sure there are plenty of good people, but the good people tend to be involved in things like nonviolent resistance. When it comes down to shooting people and burning down buildings, then the bad people tend to come to the fore, and that seems to be what we've got. And man, was this just fucked up. Did you have a nominee for most fucked up moment from the film or book?
Yeah, for the film, I mean, for the film, I'm sure that many people would have chosen the scene where they loaded people into the barn and then said, you could pass your kids out, or they could stay with you. But I'm actually.
If you don't have kids, you can leave the barn. That was the offer, and the protagonist took it. He jumped out.
Right. That's right. Now, I would take the scene where his friend was gang raped, after having survived all that stuff. And
yes, here's a girl who jumped out with her baby. They threw the baby back in, dragged her off to a truck.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, there's a fairly quick segue from what's based on the Derlevanger Battalion. We'll talk about Oscar Derlevanger extensively in a moment. Burned down this Belarusian village, herd everybody into church and burn it and shoot it. And then the scene segues very quickly to the downfall of the battalion, which these guys were great at killing civilians, but they melted like butter when they ran into actual armed opponents. And so, the protagonist of the movie comes across the remains of the Derlevanger battalion. It's not called that in the movie, but I'll call it that for convenience. And he sees his friend, the girl, come staggering out of the woods in what Wikipedia described as a fugue state, which is when you've got temporary amnesia. She's got blood running down her legs. And he repeats a line she had told him earlier, which was her whole life's ambition as this beautiful 18-year-old girl was, I just want to make love and have babies and love the babies. And he repeats that to her. And, yeah, that is exceedingly fucked up. All right.
Yeah.
So, most evil person in the book or movie?
Well, this is where you and I are going to have a parting of the ways, as I indicated.
Put words in my mouth.
Well, we're talking about Oscar de la Venga, who was a convicted child rapist, murderer, drug addict, thief, would have been rousted out.
Also a PhD in economics.
Yeah, with PhD in economics, inveterate drunk drug addict, would have been rousted out, but for various twists of fate that allowed him to fail upwards several times and ended up, head of an Einsatzgruppe, right? Am I?
Yeah, he was an Oberfuhrer.
Oberfuhrer, and I'm going to go back to my theory that there was no World War I, World War II, that there was simply a world war,
with an intermission in between.
With an intermission, there was no, there was no attempt. I mean, the Marshall Plan, what they did with the denazification, was pretty smart. Even then, you still have. I mean, like I told you. I'm not going to get Donna Shamela, but my time with the Nazi in Hamburg, not the neo-Nazi, the original version of a Nazi in Hamburg. So they made real severe efforts after World War II to straighten this out. But these guys were traumatized, fucked up, damaged individuals. If your memory in America goes back long enough, you could remember that a filmic cinematic shorthand in the 70s was to show a guy wearing camouflage gear. All you had to do was make some scintilla of a connection between Vietnam, and right away the shorthand was, this guy was fucked up. From Mickey, who was the guy, the Hells Angels Irish mobster, Mickey... the
Westies. I can't remember.
One of the Westies, cold-hearted killer. This guy came back from Vietnam fucked up, and a lot of German guys came back from World War I fucked up. I mean, Derlevanger had been wounded several times. He had, unlike many of these others, it wasn't, even if it was rearward action, he was, seeing severe action. He was an alcoholic for a reason. He could have just been an alcoholic, but he was an alcoholic for a reason. And you put this guy in a position to reenact the trauma, and mix in, the combustible mix of drugs and alcohol. And, we have that shit in America now without war. I'm not saying he's not an evil man, but there seems to me to be a large absence of exercise of free will. There's not a single point in Derlevanger's existence, printed public historical existence that I can read, where the guy was making choices that were not fueled by things that allow him to back off those choices. A la, I was fucked up, and that's an excuse that, exculpatory reasons we use all the time. I was not in my right mind.
He was once so drunk at a presentation to the German High Command that he got the country wrong that they were engaging in.
Okay. I'm more. Yeah, I got people dancing in the background here. I am more critical of the idea that he is stupid than the fact that he is evil. And anyway,
PhD in economics.
Yeah, well, okay, we need to define.
University of Frankfurt.
We need to define some terms. When we talk about evil, the closest definition I heard to evil.
See, you're putting words in my mouth. I haven't picked my most evil character, and I don't think I would pick Derlevanger. I find him the most fascinating and the most amusing.
Okay, I was trying. It's like chess. I was trying to block your next move.
I was just letting you just letting the rope go out.
Go ahead. Well, I mean.
Well, no, you picked the most evil person in the book or the movie. Book is nonfiction. The movie is fictionalized history.
I'm going to have to go with let me step into my definition of evil, which I was going to say the closest I've heard when I interviewed Anton LaVey from the Church of Satan. he couldn't answer. He came up with, he goes, well, what's evil is what doesn't feel good. I go, a root canal doesn't feel good. Is that evil? He's like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. That's eventually what he said. And the closest I came was to hear somebody describe it as consciousness of wrongdoing, which flies in the face of Aristotelian theory, which says that no man consciously does evil. So, consciousness of wrongdoing, I think, is what qualifies evil. I'm going to have to give it to Stalin.
Absolutely. I have to agree. The most evil. He made Hitler look like an absolute amateur.
Yeah.
I would say. I mean, and Stalin was poisoned by his own security guards after he hatched a plot that was too fiendish even for Beria, the head of the NKVD, to support. But give us a favorite or a most horrible, least favorite horrible evil stunt Stalin pulled on somebody.
Well, I'll give you. You said favorite, so I'll go with my favorite. When he had his security system put in. Do you know this story?
Go, yes.
He had an office, and Stalin said, I can't trust anybody. I need the top of the flight security system. Can you get me somebody to put it in? This is way back in the olden days, but they found some guy, probably a cross between an electrician and a programmer today. He would have been. And they found some guy, and he's like putting this shit in Stalin's office, and finally, he and he's really proud of his work, and he shows Stalin, this is the top flight. Nobody can figure this out. I'll explain it to you. You'll know how to. And Stalin goes, nobody can figure it out. He goes, yeah, let me explain it to you. He goes, well, you can figure it out. He goes, yeah, I put it in, but you could once I tell you. And so he painstakingly takes Stalin through it. Stalin goes, thank you very much. And at the conclusion of the meeting, he has him shot.
And that is exactly the essence of Stalin. I think my favorite Stalin moments are all moments where he sets somebody up and then destroys them for the very thing they did at his bidding. Like in the starvation of the Ukraine, he ultimately defined starving to death as a counter-revolutionary act against the revolution.
Because they were hiding food.
They were hiding food, and they were so evil and so bent on a counter-revolution, they were starving themselves and eating their children rather than eating the food they were hiding because they weren't meeting their grain requisition numbers. Right. And then
anybody who's had a boss can appreciate the lunacy behind something like that. You're not meeting your numbers. I got 7. Your new number is 9. You're not meeting your numbers. When did it switch to 9? You're being insubordinate.
Yes, and my favorite twist, though, is after a couple of years of this, then he launches a persecution of the local Ukrainian communist officials for allowing that counter-revolutionary activity to take place and not persecuting it sufficiently enough. So he uses his own cat's paws and then blames them, and they're the next target of the extermination. That Uncle Joe, man, he was a mean, evil, rotten motherfucker, and I think we both have to agree, the most evil by far, an almost unfathomable level of evil.
Well, I thought that, and I thought, actually, in terms of recent history at least, the one who killed more people was Mao. Mao is the greatest of all time, as far as I know, 70 mil to his account. But,
those numbers are very hard to come by, though. The Chinese didn't keep as accurate records, and it's also arguable whether or not Mao knew he was starving people during the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So Mao is. We will talk about Mao in a future episode because Mao is.
Well, hold on. But I was actually going to give him a way out. I'm going to say about Mao that, according in June Chang's book on Mao, where she breaks open, he actually seems to me like just a lazy guy.
Big opium user.
Yeah, when people say Mao and Maoism, I really think me and meism. He was just, the hike through the jungle that he was supposed to against the Kuomintang when he was fighting Chiang Kai-shek in the Nationalist Army. I discover in her book that he wasn't marching; he was being carried. And
he had to write orders all night, and so
he was reading and eating. Eating apparently. So all these guys, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, all had something in common. You know what that was?
You're going to say it's bad fathers.
Bad fathers. Yes, thank you.
So, hopefully I'm doing right by my boy and not Stalin's father of the 3, from what I know, I haven't read a great number of bios on Stalin, but Stalin's father seems like the most awful of the three, and Mao's father, from what I've read, isn't quite in the same level of active horrific abuse. At least
Even though Mao had that quote, he goes, "If ever there was a man born for jet planing, my father was it." Yeah, my father was him. And to explain to people what jet planing was, it's where they tied your arms up behind you and cinched them to a pole. The Nazis had a different name for it, and then just left you there until your shoulder sockets broke out and you suffocated to death.
The Maoists frequently combine that with a self criticism session. So you'd have to confess to all your sins. But we're off topic. Get off Mao. Back to Stalin and Hitler. All right. So let's throw a curveball. Redeeming moment. Is there any redeeming moments in this book or movie where you went, yay, the good guys? There's a glimmer of sunshine. Anything come to mind?
Well, I'll give you a story that you would have to go way back in the Knuckle Up archives to Donna Shalala me on this one. And if you can, then you get it like a T-shirt for having had a great memory. But it has to do with when I went to Bergen-Belsen. Do you remember this story?
I do not. Okay,
we went to Bergen-Belsen on some tour. Our sound guy at the time was a Swissman who his family escaped from Poland, Switzerland during the war, wrote it out, and they made it. He now lives in Berlin, and he was really opposed to it, didn't want to go. They said, look, we got to do it. You can sit in the van if you want. So we went to Bergen-Belsen, and we're walking. Our drummer at the time was a Russian-Ukrainian, his first generation, father born there. Father was actually in the Hitler Youth, and forced at gunpoint to be in the Hitler Youth. Ended up working in America for many years at Lockheed, doing missile defense systems. So part of the brain drain that happened immediately post-war. But we're walking through Bergen-Belsen, and he's ranting. He's ranting about where are the memorials for the Russian war dead? And finally we stumble on a memorial for the Russian war dead at Bergen-Belsen, and he launches into this speech about how that this shows the indomitability ultimately of the human spirit, and that good people will prosper, man's inhumanity to man, and our unwise ways forgotten, and looking forward to a bright new future bereft of brutality. And right then, screaming overhead from the military air base that abuts Bergen-Belsen was the flight of about 4 or 5 F-14s or I mean, really super low. I don't know if you've ever been close to these things. Super low and super loud. And then they started having artillery trials. and Tom Dobroff, who's kind of a nervous guy anyway, Tom Dobroff was really shaken, and he goes, and he's like, and they're just dropping artillery bombs like crazy. I mean, it's not dropping them on Bergen-Belsen, but as close now as, 300 yards away based on the plumes of dust we're seeing, And he just like fucking shakes his head. He goes, people are shit. And he goes back to the van where he rides out the rest of our time at Bergen-Belsen. And so I say, all of these movies, or the movie and the book, will try to fundamentally, tacitly, kind of get you around to that same idea that, the survivors are writing the history books because good will conquer evil. And I'm like, man, that shit is situational, Jack. Based on my time with the Nazi in Hamburg, hey, you denazification program, my ass, man. Yeah. It doesn't. I mean, you need to have your finger perpetually in the air. There was a guy who was telling me his family, they knew what was going on in Germany. Hitler had these back in the 20s. We knew. So my family, he said, they moved. I go, oh man, good for you. Where'd they go? England? He goes, nah, I went to Poland.
Crafty devils.
Man, you got it. People say, Eugene, why do you read the news so much? I don't really give a shit about. I'm putting my finger in the air, man. I mean, like the guy, like Rob De Niro said in Heat. Are you ready to walk away from everything, taking nothing? You got to be ready. So
exactly. You read about these families, where in fact, my wife's stepfather's family, he had an uncle who was a Dutch farmer. He struggled in South Africa. Then he had an offer to go work for Texaco in Texas, and he chose to go back to Holland instead. And
what year?
This was in the late 1930s. And so he and 2 of his sons were killed by the Nazis for being involved in resistance. And that's just and there's no way he couldn't have predicted World War II. However, some people saw that it was coming. And Texas in the 1940s was a much cushier deal than Holland in the 1940s.
Hey, well, you know Karl Gotch's story, right?
Do tell,
Karl Gotch, the famous the father of pro wrestling in Japan, great catch wrestler, who died a few years ago. In my fight book, which he talks about, the Germans come into the Netherlands or to Belgium, and he's like, oh man, I'm hearing tanks and stuff. I'm gonna go see what's going on. So we'll go to the store and get some milk. I mean, really, it's a glimpse into the fact that this was, blitzkrieg my ass. I hear trucks in the village square. So he's 16 years old, or I think he was some kind of teenager, and he walks to see the tanks. And, a German soldier on the back of a truck sees him, says, hey, kid, come here. And so, like any kid, like I at 16 probably would have got, hey, I want to see what the soldiers want. Comes over the truck and says, get in. Well, no, I'm just getting some milk for my mom. Get in. Take him away to a Nazi work camp, Eventually he gets out. Unclear. I'm not remembering now how Karl Gotch gets out. But he gets out. He spoke a number of different languages. He's a pretty tough kid. So he gets out, goes back home. His family's so happy. We thought you were dead. He goes back home. His mother says, look, go to the store. get me some milk. He goes back out, is, requisitioned again, put on the back of a truck, taken off to a work camp. I mean, if you go, there's still bullet holes in buildings in Berlin, man, that you just can't fix. They go, screw it. This was civilian populations, real people, real lives in your city. It's remote for a lot of Americans, but this shit is not remote to Europeans.
No, and I think America inevitably is going to have a day of reckoning. We haven't had war in this continent since the Civil War in the 1800s, which was pretty awful, but Bush League stuff compared to what Europe.
Oh, you're sorely mistaken if you think we're going to have a day of reckoning that looks anything like that. America.
I don't know, man. I think at some point there will be mass violence in North America again within the next 100 years.
Oh, are you talking like a Red Dawn type scenario?
No, I'm not talking about Red Dawn. I'm talking about probably some sort of civil conflagration.
Okay, all right.
But the shit will hit the fan in this country. I guarantee it, especially with climate change and famine.
That we can. We all got to duck.
When the shit hits the fan, circle jerks. All right, so redeeming moments. You don't have any.
No. The redeeming moment I have is the okie doke, where they say, "Look, the indomitability of the human spirit. We survived," and that being not true. It's like, we survived. Gouge. That's the people in Cambodia. Oh, indomitability of the human spirit. Gouge. What man learns about the inhumanity of man? Artillery test at Bergen-Belsen. No, we don't learn.
Yeah, it's true, we don't learn. But there were a couple moments that I found emotionally satisfying, and I do want to mention them. And that was the resistance, both in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the rape of Warsaw. In both instances, first the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then the second instance, the Poles in Warsaw, both put up surprisingly stiff resistance in the face of certain death. And they just went out with a big fuck you, guns blazing. Like in the Warsaw Ghetto, they'd been abducting the women and children and the old people for so long that they had left themselves. When the Nazis decided to wipe out the Warsaw Ghetto, it was all young dudes.
Yeah.
And they had been actively arming themselves. And the first few days, it was a bloodbath as the Nazis were going in and getting shot. Eventually, of course, they figured out they could burn the buildings. It was a lot like Chechnya. A few years ago, about 20 years ago, when the Chechens gave the Russians total hell in urban warfare, and then the Russians realized, well, we can just destroy their city, and then we don't have to deal with urban warfare anymore. So that was a tiny bit of redemption.
Destroy their city and then put in their man Kadyrov, fight fan Kadyrov.
Yes, problem solved and a happy ending for everybody. And Chechens, are still today considered the pound for pound, man for man, the toughest fighters on earth. All right, so. The most vicious betrayal. This is a Eugene S. Robinson fetish, the act of betrayal. What do you think the most vicious betrayal in the book or the movie was?
When I close my eyes, I dream of betrayals, which was something I lifted from a South African fascist. It was a long-time logo for Oxbow. It actually printed up on some of our shirts, Because people always understood it as, when I close my eyes, I dream of people betraying me. when actually the Oxford interpretation was, when I close my eyes, I dream of every way I'm going to betray all the rest of yous. So,
welcome to the ninth circle of hell, Dante's.
Well, I have to say, in keeping with as a philosophical constant, I have to say that I think that the betrayals that you don't see coming, like for example, the German betrayal of the Soviet Pact, in my mind, that was just Stalin napping. He was paying attention to killing people. He got a little too busy. Got sucker punched. That's not surprising to me.
I mean, he had slaughtered all his best intelligence agents and generals, and so somehow he wasn't getting good intelligence.
Yeah, imagine that. So I'm going to have to say that was on him. I don't really count that as a high class betrayal. But I'm going to have to. In other words, I think had his eyes open, he would have seen that coming.
He would have struck first, probably.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with, even though this wasn't explicitly gone into, I'm going to have to go with with Rome.
With what?
Rome, Ernst Röhm.
Oh, the Night of the Long Knives. That's not even in the book or the movie.
That's what I just said. It's not even technically in the book. But when my mind goes back to what I think was a colossal. I mean, he did not see that coming at all.
He did not. There he was in bed with one of his little boyfriends, and they come for him.
And also, I have to measure the post facto damage. And apparently, depending on which reports you read afterward, that this was a moment. It's like that Charles Atlas thing, the lesson that made a man out of Mac. That this was a moment where Hitler, endured a great psychological disturbance as a result of the Night of the Long Knives. He realized it was not with glee that I think he attached himself to this task. He was first and foremost, up to this point, he had been a soldier. He was one of those guys like Lieutenant David Grossman in his book On Killing. He said that the numbers have switched, and that in recent military engagements, humans are killing humans more frequently than they ever did. He said, I'm not saying that the people in past wars were cowards. They distinguished themselves in other ways, really brave ways, and that's what Hitler had done in the First World War. Was not big on killing people, but was consistently putting himself into harm's way to rescue people who had been hurt. So he was. I mean, you don't do that unless you have a really super strongly defined sense of esprit de corps. And Rome was first and foremost was a problem, but was
Rome was the head of the stormtroopers, the street fighting units that brought the Nazis to power.
Yeah, right. Waffen SS, and he just never saw it
coming.
SA,
not the SS.
I'm sorry. Waffen SA, and he didn't see it coming. Hitler was disturbed. Hitler was disturbed. I think we just stopped there.
Yeah. Well, it was a deal where Rome and his street fighters, he had big plans to merge his street militias with the army, take over the German military. Hitler chose to ally with the old Prussian military again, and Rome was the sacrificial lamb. And Himmler, the head of the SS, Himmler and Rome had been kind of both sidekicks of Hitler and competing rivals. And Doris Kearns Goodman's phrase, the cabinet of rivals. It was just a bit more bare knuckle in the Nazi regime, and Hitler made his choice, and Rome had to be snuffed. The homosexuality was the pretext for it, and that is a brutal brand of homosexuality, man. I mean, I'm really happy to have not ever fallen into the sweaty paws of Ernst Röhm and break your nose and sodomize you kind of loving that they were into.
Except as I learned from watching The View, and this I'm about to break something really big here. The first time publicly, national audience, I'm going to break. I was watching The View.
You're man enough to admit it. Go ahead.
And Joyce Behar talked about a recent study that came out that said that the smallest penises in the world belong to German men.
Smaller than Asians.
Well, Japan was in there as well.
I see.
If you tried to buy condoms in Japan, you might have a sense of they're all like novelty items. So then we have 2/3 of the Axis powers right there. So I am making a connection between penis size and proclivities toward extreme violence. And then people go, well, what about the third leg on that stool of Axis powers? What about the Italians? I go, the Italians were very bad fascists, Why? Because they were all screwing comfortably somewhere. There was always a dint of sexual sadism in the whole German Japanese approach to how they attach themselves to the war. So penal size had something to do with it, but amusingly, and I think I haven't seen anybody address that. So academically, if you're an academic, it's all yours. Just credit me somewhere in the credits or acknowledgments.
Or The View.
The View didn't step to the Axis powers and make it a
They didn't make the connection. They just reported the study.
They reported the study. So, but what I think noteworthy is there was a recent there's a book called The Beast Within, and the guy talks about the neo-Nazi movement as it goes back to Dave Emery is the first one to tip me off to it, and it's a great book, The Beast Within. And they talk about a neo-Nazi group where one of the, all these cults of strength, where the leaders said, we can't squander our essence by screwing women. And all the guys were like, yeah! So we won't have a movement with any women. Yeah! So we recognize that men have needs. Yeah! So we're going to have sex with each other. Yeah! Ugh. What?
Well, Ernst Röhm, was a extolled homoeroticism enthusiastically, and it was his undoing because the Nazis, and that to me, the situational ethics of the Nazis, the fact that they claim to be this shining example of morality, but then somebody like Derlevanger and Derlevanger's battalion, and we got to talk about Derlevanger. This was the guy. Frequently named as the leader of the most savage and barbaric European military unit since Attila the Hun.
Well, and we have to say something. I really want to say something because I remember when I started reading about the Nazis when I was 9 or 10 years old, and they kind of, as a kid, you're like, man, these guys are ultimate badasses. If I'm online at Safeway or CVS or any one of your local markets, and I turn and I punch the 75-year-old lady in the face behind me, that doesn't make me tough.
This is very true.
She just didn't see it coming, that's all.
She might take you in the rematch. Yeah,
right.
And the whole myth of German military superiority. You want to master race the Anglo-Normans since 1066 when William the Conqueror took over England. The fucking Anglo-Normans haven't lost a war. I mean, they've come close, and they had some setbacks in France in the 100 Years' War and stuff, but their record is spectacular. And anybody who's followed war over a longer view knows the Germans' record in war is dismal. They had a couple of lucky breaks, wiped out a couple of Roman legions, had a big reputation for fierceness in the Roman era. Obviously, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, swept over the Mediterranean in the end. However, like the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, which is where modern war, all the innovations of modern chemical mechanical warfare were tested in the 30 Years' War. The Germans, that was the raping field. That was the football field all the other Europeans met on to plunder and savage. So this idea of Germans as some sort of military master race is fucking laughable. And, even now...
So I just want that as a proviso when you describe Derlevanger as savage. I mean, he doesn't mean militarily competent.
No.
Or strong, or capable, or he just means that the guy was a piece of shit.
Yes, an utter piece of shit. His troops were called, originally they were poachers, and the idea was they would round up German poachers who were in jail for, hunting illegally, and they thought they would be good outdoorsmen, and they would be useful against the partisans in Belarus, because outside of Minsk, it's swamps, it's forests, you're fighting guys who know the territory, very tough situation. They dredge up Derlevanger out of jail, give him a command.
Drunk in jail.
Drunk in jail. They drag him up. He had actually gotten out of concentration camp to go fight for Franco in Spain. Distinguished himself for his heroism in combat. God knows what he was up to there. And but eventually, pretty quickly, they're just scraping up the bottom, like the worst scumbags in German prisons. Deliberate murderers, rapists, robbers, criminally insane, and Derlevanger somehow could control these people well enough to get them driving in the same direction and slaughtering the same people. And so that was the sort of the extent. But the sadism and the brutality was unparalleled. And the thing that kills me about the Derlevanger battalion, every time they went up, not even against military units, when they went up against partisans, they got their asses kicked. They had a minus 315% death ratio in the rape of Warsaw. When they weren't murdering nuns in hospitals, they were getting their asses kicked by Polish postmen who had shitty little, handguns, zip guns and shit that they had built together. And when the Russians finally turned the tide in Belarus, Derlevanger and his ilk were just swept aside like chaff in the wind. I mean, they were terrible combat fighters unless they were fighting women or children. It's like somebody said about Carmine the Snake. Is it Persico, the former head of the Colombo family? A guy who grew up in his neighborhood said, Junior wasn't tough unless he had 2 or 3 of his guys holding it down. Then he was pretty tough. And so that was Derlevanger. And the fact that it doesn't take you very long at all in English, if you start Googling Derlevanger, to find neo-Nazis who are extolling this asshole as some sort of ideal or hero. And if you're in German, it's even quicker. And like that to me is like the definitive neo-Nazi mentality there, that you're picking out the worst, most utterly failed scumbag and extolling him as some kind of hero or model. I don't know. That says everything to me about the Nazism being a sort of a suicide drive. Like Hitler, to me, his ultimate victim was Germany. Like that, the Jews were a scapegoat and obviously suffered disproportionately, but Hitler's real mission seems to have been a suicide trip for Germany. And certainly, any leader who takes your country from struggling to complete ruins in 12 years is a shitty leader.
Well, right, and I mean, ultimately, his comments, which you have talked about before, I think were most telling. He and Albert Speer are hanging out together toward the end, and he's advising him to bomb the industrial, infrastructure of the country, to throw salt in all the fields, in essence, just to complete the total destruction of Germany, to not leave it for anybody. I'm going to burn down my house before you could burn down my house. And Hitler said at one point with the Speer and said, the German people have failed me.
Exactly. The German people have failed me. Thank you, Uncle Adolf.
So long. I'm on my submarine. I'll see you in Argentina.
Indeed. All right. So most wicked scheme from the book or movie, and try to stay on topic. I know that you it's hard.
I'm gonna have to say. I'm gonna have to say the War on European Jewry.
The War on European Jewry, Reinhard Heydrich's the final solution. Yep. Yeah,
because I mean, if it's really telling when you start to read about the percentage of the population, the Jewish population in any of these places, Germany, Poland. I mean, it was a really supremely well-chosen scapegoat. But what was completely maddening about it is that in very German fashion, they could have probably stopped well before they did, and it's
it would have been in their own interest to stop well before they did.
Right.
I mean, they were diverting resources from the battlefield so they could get more people to Treblinka to kill them.
Which makes it, like you say, suicidal, insanely suicidal. But it was also aggressively short-sighted, and I don't want to use the word dog-headed because it insults dogs, but it just never made any sense. At a certain point, as a rallying cry, I mean, I was reading with interest a guy from Yale, Christopher Browning, who wrote like an answer book to Daniel Goldhagen and Hitler's Flipping Executioners, but it just after a certain point, it just didn't make any sense. It's like the Irish mafia guys mugging a guy on the way to robbing a bank. It was perverse and perversely pursued, and a clear indication, if there was any, that these guys had lost their minds.
Yeah, and I also think that targeting German Jewry, I mean, this is one of the most distinguished, accomplished ethnic groups in any country. I mean, this is one of the treasures of Germany, and to target, your most gifted minority group and destroy them and drive them out of the country is just fucking stupid and evil and insane. And the systematic, like, if you read this stuff, one thing I like about Bloodlands is it does try to give a fairer picture of, like, how much the Ukrainians suffered, how much the Poles suffered, how much the Belarusians suffered, how much the Gypsies suffered. But there's a point at which there were never death camps organized, systematically killing any of those groups in the millions. They were starving the Ukrainians in the millions, but it was never fucking trains. It was never tattoos on the arm. It was never mechanized and as efficient and as awful as what was done to the Jews and the Gypsies and the homosexuals in the Holocaust. And it just, there's a point at which, I mean, once you've committed a capital crime, what's worse? Starving everybody in the Ukraine or destroying European Jewry. It's all fucking death penalty stuff. Like, it's all as bad as you can get. But there is something uniquely horrifying about the Holocaust. However, I do want to point out, I think it's a trap that certain Jews have fallen into, to think that only they have suffered. Anytime you get into an ethnic group where, we're the ones who've really suffered, you're falling into that fucking Hitler logic and the race war shit. And so just an awful trap to be.
Well, I mean, you might, if you were Jewish, generally, categorically, you might want to try lightly on that, but I think it's also a truism that nobody has suffered like the Jews have suffered, and nobody has suffered for quite as long.
Well, it's very true. The Jewish people have a long, sad history, but also a really proud history. And the history of rabbinical Judaism is one of renouncing power and renouncing combat and renouncing freedom of society.
I have friends who were in the JDL who would say, that's part of the problem.
Well, I mean, clearly Zionism is a reaction against that, and ultimately rabbinical Judaism in Europe, it failed. I mean, it had a run, it had a proud run, and it makes me very sad. But I mean, you don't. Ultimately, nonviolence didn't work against Hitler.
Well, I mean, even still, there was a friend of mine who I spoke about before. Was talking about them interviewing this rabbi from what had been East Germany, and they were interviewing him on a German TV show, asking him how things were now that the wall had fallen, and 10 years after the wall had fallen. And the guy said, well, before the wall had fallen, I used to get beaten up every day. And now, after the wall has fallen, I only get beaten up once a week, so things are a lot better.
That is fucking awful. And, people are really awful. So
but you know what? But I want to, again, like I said I was going to do in our email exchange, I want to, like the Kanye West song for all the scumbags, I want to kind of not so much excuse them, but I want to explain it. And I want to with a story that is maybe not quite so tasteful, but at one point I had been attacked by a dog. I had been, anybody who's paid attention to my spoken word would have heard this story before. In fact, this is the story that made a guy in Austin storm out of the club, come back into the club after I had finished, come up to the merchandise table, and tell me that he had gone to his truck to get his gun to shoot me. That's how upset he was with the story. And I said, you realize, one, it was a fucking story, and two, at that point, then I pulled my shirt back. I said, you're going to shoot me with a gun like this? And I had a gun in my waistband. It's like, man, you don't threaten to shoot a guy. If you're going to shoot. You're going to talk.
Yeah.
The story wasn't celebrating what I'm about to describe. It was just detailing what had happened, and I got attacked by a pit bull. Minding my own business, the dog latched onto my hand, and I made a terrible mistake. I tried to kick the dog off my hand, and the dog was like holding on to my left hand. And I always carry a pocket knife, so I pulled out the pocket knife because I thought that a visual identification with a knife, like a human, would go, oh my God, he's got a knife. And the dog, I remember looking up at me like a shark, just kind of looking up like, what? You got something in your hand, so what? So, long story much shorter, I had to stab the dog, and then the dog ran away, and as soon as I could, I shot the dog. Terrible, terrible, terrible day for me. I did not enjoy it at all. I don't even think I need to say that, but what happened post-facto was really interesting. I'd gotten super into hunting, like super into hunting. I was into boar hunting. I didn't successfully manage to catch any boar because they're pretty crafty. Yeah, I can't sneak up on a house cat, much less shoot a boar, but I tried, and I went and goose hunting. I did much better with the goose hunting, and then finally, when I got out of that period of being really into hunting, I said, what the hell was that about? And it was all post facto to the killing of this dog that was attacking me, And I thought, clearly, without even knowing it, I was trying to make some sort of sense of what I found to be a psychologically distressing event in my life, And I was, fundamentally, I'm not saying it's addictive, but I'm saying, a less enlightened person might find themselves compelled and driven toward behaviors and not even quite sure they know why. This is what lays behind serial killing, So these guys, the trauma of World War I, which never really ended, came back and found themselves, again, driven by alcohol, drug abuse, doing shit that they themselves did not understand. How many times do you hear that during, I was following orders, yeah, but I'm talking about 30 years on when they're making these documentaries, these German news teams are talking to these guys, and they're like, there was a time. You had to have been there. I mean, they don't really fully grasp what had happened or why, but it happened.
Yeah, I think your experience of shedding blood and then being compelled to reenact that's something people do. That's like the Wild Wild West was so wild in part because so many Civil War veterans were out there processing what they'd been through. And, some would say the police brutality we're seeing in America right now is a product of so many of our police having served in Iraq and Afghanistan,
right.
and bringing those habits of dealing with an occupied people and bringing that home to trying to protect and serve here in the United States, which is just a fucked up mess. I have a nominee.
I heard the counter argument that it was caused by the guy, like there was this nice period, where most of the people serving on police forces had served in Vietnam, were soldiers, and were used to structure. And then there was a period post facto where you had non-military guys on police forces, and there's a claim that that's when stuff went to hell. I mean, how many cops do you know? I know lots of cops who also served in the military. Most of the cops I know today never served in the military.
It's true. Very few Americans have served in the military, so there's less and less. So I'm probably being too hard on our veterans. So I do have a nominee for Most Wicked Scheme. It's not on the magnitude of the Holocaust, but it was just something I thought was just really shitty. And that was when Hitler and his associates in NKVD, not Hitler, Stalin, came up with what they called the Polish plot. And so after they'd been purging, they'd been starving the Ukrainians, then they turned on themselves with these purges. And at some point they decided that the Poles were spying on them and stirring up trouble in Ukraine, like instigating people to starve themselves. And so the NKVD officer, who was the head commander in the Ukraine, was the first to call attention to this Polish plot. And within months, he himself was executed for failing to sufficiently prosecute that with enough diligence. And the guy who turned on him and rose all the way to the top of the NKVD, it was the guy before Beria, I can't remember the name, Yakov maybe.
Yep.
And that was just so fucked up. Like, so one guy comes up with an imaginary plot against the Soviet Revolution, and another guy says, you know what, you're right, and it's even worse than you said, so much so that you're a betrayer of the country, and wrote it all the way to the fucking top. I mean, I just thought that was a singularly wicked and shitty thing to do.
Also known as the "he who smelt it dealt it" theory of political retribution. Oh, they're insurgents there, huh? I got it. You're the lead insurgent,
Yep.
Because, I mean, all of us who've worked at corporate jobs know that that's, of course, the guy you want to kill. You know who you don't kill? The guy who comes in and says, everything's all right, sir. All right. That's because I can go back to my boss and say, everything's all right. Guy, what did Stalin say? No problem. No man, no problem.
It's
guy
true.
Comes in and says they're insurgents. God damn, you just created a shitload of work for me. You gotta go. If I could think how many times in meetings I've wanted to shoot somebody like that, I look, it would be, had I been back there, I'd have marched him out to the wall myself.
Yep, and that one thing that they bring up in Bloodlands is that the resistance to the Germans on the part of in cities like Minsk and former Soviet-held cities, they were so paralyzed because they were so traumatized by the Stalinist purges. The survivors had learned, don't do anything. Like if Stalin has a new initiative, kind of hang towards the back of the pack. Like it's always those guys out leading the charge that end up getting hung afterwards. So just hang to the back of the pack. And so the only people that organized the resistance in Minsk were these random assholes like who came from Poland and different places and were too naive to know how to operate in the Stalinist system. And so, anyway,
I have to say something too that I think we can focus on let's call them the contiguous dead. The people whose death was closely matched to the times in which they were dying. But I see the real tragedy, if we're going to talk about real tragedies, are not the 40 million people dead, not the, somebody once said, Goldhagen once said, you to understand, Nazi Germany, you have to understand that every act of murder was accompanied by an act of theft, the thievery, the kleptocracy, none of these things, I see the most lasting and enduring damage that's occurred as a result of Hitler, Mao, and Stalin has been, negative eugenics, the culling of the herd of the most talented fucking individuals, and
And this was deliberately done against the Ukraine and Poland especially, where they targeted the intelligentsia. Anybody who was a police officer, a military officer, a college professor, a writer, a journalist, even a forester was systematically targeted by Stalin for extermination. And if you believe that genes have an influence on people's talents and abilities, which I believe most people do, you decapitate a population like that, and where does that leave a country? Same thing happened in Russia. They did it to themselves, or Stalin did it to the Russian people, where they kept the thing to me the difference between Stalin and Hitler is Stalin was operating under the premise of we want to keep this going. Like they concealed what they were doing. Like they kept the Ukraine. They managed to starve almost 4 million Ukrainians to death, and hardly anybody knew about it. And the Nazis were so fucking stupid. They were just out there in broad daylight doing this shit and keeping perfect records of what they were doing. And at one point when the Nazis didn't manage to conquer Russia immediately, which never plan on conquering Russia immediately. That's never been a good plan. They at one point, a couple years into the Eastern Front War, sent a propaganda specialist to Belarus saying, what can we tell the Belarusians to convince them to fight on our side against the Russians? And the guy spent 6 weeks out there and is like, look, we've had the Derlebanger battalion out here running rampant on these people. There is nothing we can there's even our bullshit artists, even Goebbels himself, could not come up with a line of bullshit we can tell these people. They would rather suffer under Stalin than have any truck with us. And that's, it's a feat of savagery and incompetence when you would make people who've experienced the Stalinist purges and the Stalinist terror say, you know what, I think I'd rather have Uncle Joe back. I mean...
Well, I mean, again, like I've said as well, I mean, these guys worked a number on their countries. Germany, maybe to your point, Germany has bounced back much more aggressively and in better shape than... the Germans didn't set about killing all their talented people. They only set about killing the Jewish talented people. Maybe some of the politically backward or the gay German, political, whatever. But Stalin, it lasted longer, killed more. I mean, these countries are so much the worse for it. And there are people now in Poland, Hungary, and Romania who would widely agree with me that there's stuff that's happening in their countries. The brain drain that a place like Poland is undergoing now, not just because people can't get jobs, but because, the political system don't believe anything you read that's talking about a Polish resurgence or the country is in crisis, and you've got right-wing elements now. They're trying to have, there was a play that they were going to have as part of this big media arts festival. The neo-Nazis turn up because neo-Nazis aligned with the Catholic Church who say one of the plays was about the Madonna, not the singer, but the Mother Mary. Mother of Jesus, and they were like, this is sacrilege, and they showed up and they said, we will tear this theater down, we will beat up everybody in it. I mean, this is kind of, the best and the brightest of these countries were just destroyed, and the countries are so much the worse for it now. Russia, why do people do not want to stay in these countries? You know, and there's got to be a reason for that. So, you know.
Yeah, I've read a number of things where Russians themselves have talked about how, all the best, and not just the best and brightest, but also the most moral people. Like, that's one thing that I think Come and See makes very clear, is that even the protagonist, to survive the village being burned, he crawled out of the barn. He took the fucking shame. All these other men are there with their families and everything, and they give him an out in that this wasn't his village.
Right.
These weren't his little brothers and sisters or anything, and he's a very young guy. But he, climbed over people's head and said, fuck it, I'm out of here, man. I'll take the Nazis up on their offer and survive over having any dignity. And, a number of Holocaust survivors, have written, was it Primo Levi, the Italian survivor of Auschwitz, was ultimately a victim of survivor's guilt. I mean, he was just like, look, I saw the best people, and they died in the camps. The things I did to survive are not things I can live with anymore. And that's a heavy burden. And as we head into another possible cycle of crisis and nightmare, it's scary to think, because the tradition of humanist progress in Germany and Russia and Poland, just amazing cultural accomplishments in all of those countries. And you wonder, where are the heirs of Goethe? They're gone.
That's what I was reading, some German neo-Nazi stuff, and if you knuckle up again, I would have talked about my connection to Rockorama Records, it was Hermann Eagles, who was the #1 race war label in Germany. Ultimately, I was doing business with this guy. He wanted to license a Stigmata record that I used to open the Knuckle Up. And it was amusing to me. This is way before the internet. We were writing letters back and forth. And, of course, I was doing business with the guy because I knew that nobody had the heart to tell him, much like Clayton Bigsby, nobody had the heart to tell him that I was black. So I was like, man, I'm going to take this neo-Nazi's money, and it's just going to be great. He's going to and then at some point, I could tell he had figured it out because he refused to communicate with me anymore. And he just goes, he told the guys at Stigmata, I'll give you money to record a new record for me. I think his original plan was to record the same record, but to their credit, the guys in Stigmata, even though they had the bad taste to go with, a German neo-Nazi label to put their stuff out, I don't know what that was about, but to their credit, they were like, we can't screw Eugene over that way. We're not going to record the same songs again. We have other songs. So they recorded with Rockorama, put the record out, and then, of course, Ego got busted. They shut down the label. But, I mean, these guys were saying at one point in some of their, he sent me a bunch of stuff to the label, and I'm kind of reading through it, and oh my God, I forgot what my point was. No. It played off your original point about the best and the brightest, and actually I forgot what the point.
Well, I'll try to tie it back up. You read about what's going on in Afghanistan, and it's nightmarish. And one of the things that some people say is a reason for this terrible, horrific cultural degradation is that there's been a war going on for 30 years. You've got generations of adults who've never lived in a civilized, stable environment. The literacy rate is a fraction of what it was. And the thing about civilization is it's not just here. Civilization is something we have to build and maintain. It's a torch that you have to keep lit and pass on to future generations. And I'm not going to blame the Afghani people for being, in the epicenter of this intercontinental great game and being, victims of Soviet invasion, American invasion, the Taliban, and all this shit. But, it's a warning to everybody that culture can fail and culture can recede, and that we really need to keep our shit together, and those of us who perhaps are paranoid and see storms coming down the horizon, hunker down, keep those books from being burned and the disc from being erased,
or what Bernard Lewis, the Princeton professor, talks about when he talks about the Middle East. He goes, it's a crisis of modernity. These countries are, you got some who are ahead of the curve, like Turkey, but large numbers of these countries are struggling with modern world, man. I just read some report, the guys in ISIS, not the band, the Iraqi fighters, that these guys are like advertising on dating sites for women.
I was reading that yesterday. Yeah, they're picking up Western girls are going over there to join the jihad.
Match.com, my man. Go to Match.com.
Yeah, and that's scary shit. And we could talk about the Middle East another time. But I think the Middle East has never recovered from the Mongol invasion. Baghdad was this jewel of civilization. Algebra, alchemy, alcohol, astronomy, the number 0. That's how it gets, Arabic numerals are numbers. I mean, would you like to be doing math with Roman fucking numerals? That was the best the Europeans came up with. And, the Hindus invented the numerant system, but the Arabs brought it to the Western world. And it's like this jewel of civilization and progress. Once it was burned down by the Mongols, they've really never gotten on their feet again to be a leading. They've, obviously civilization has recovered, but they've never been on the leading edge of world civilization since then. And it's and who can blame them for having problems with modernity? I mean, their experience of it's being under the Turkish boot, which is infamous with oppression, and then being colonized by the British and the French, which is one of the worst fucking things. The only thing worse than that I can think of is being colonized by the Dutch. So,
and here you go, and I'm going to make another bold point, because we're talking in very broad terms about nation states. Germans, Russians, nation states, the people, the Russians, but we're really not talking about people, right? I mean, we're talking about German men and Russian men and Afghani men. And, I remember about 15 years ago, some woman had written this piece, an academic had written a piece, and she said, if every day when you went out, you were attacked by people in red sweaters, at a certain point, you'd start to get really wary of anybody wearing a red sweater. She goes, this is the crisis point where we are with gender. People are, when we talk about numbers of people going to jail for murder, it's very infrequent that those numbers would include women.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, because most of the facts on racist arguments tend to break down on facts. Gender-based arguments, men are more violent than women. There was an article in Atlantic Monthly years ago, and it was like, imagine a neighborhood filled with stay-at-home moms.
Yeah, right.
You can just imagine the laundry drying on the line, the kids playing in the fields, shopping trips, gardens, productive little village. Imagine that same neighborhood filled with stay-at-home dads. Yeah. And it's drunkenness and gambling and fornicating and fighting, and it's just like, testosterone is a fucked up thing, man. I remember when I first became an adult, and it was like, comic books and Dungeons and Dragons and video games ain't doing it anymore. Let's fucking gamble. Let's get some drugs going. Where are the whores? Like, let's have.
And that was just last week for you, right?
I'm too old for all that nowadays. But I can remember going, shit, when did my idea of a good time have to involve every vice? Yes, yeah, violence and vice and there's something to be said for it. So perhaps the matriarchy. Are we advocating matriarchy, Eugene? Is that what we've come around to?
I don't know. I mean, women, by osmosis, do foul crap.
They're the ones selecting the men to breed with, and they tend to select the biggest assholes. So.
Yeah, but I don't. I mean, this is the kind of thing where it's clearly we can talk around the problem. Wasn't there a report that came out yesterday that said, that civilization increases the lower collective men's testosterone levels are?
That was an argument that one of the evolutionary steps that they've wondered for a long time. Homo sapiens seem to have physically modernized a long time before civilization really started to take off.
Right.
And they were going, why is that? Why is it? We had fire for a long time and then didn't really have any other major tools for like hundreds of thousands of years. Most of human history, no progress. Most of the progress has been in this tiny end. And they some new studies, they think that as testosterone levels lowered, we became more civilized. So
anybody who is tarried with performance-enhancing drugs knows that I remember having incredible lunatic flights of fantasy when I was imbibing of performance-enhancing substances. I wasn't out conquering nations, but I had ideas that were worthy of that kind of megalomania on a very small scale. But what I wasn't doing then I look at how productive I've been post facto to this time, and I look at how productive I was. I had lots of ideas and lots of talk, very little follow through during post facto. A lot more effective, a lot more records, a lot more books, a lot more coherent activity toward a positive end versus the time when I was on, where I managed to do a lot of weightlifting and a lot of sex and weightlifting, pretty much. Sex
and smack talk. Don't forget shit talking.
Yeah, I did a lot of that, and fighting. I did a lot of that as well. So there you go. Increased testosterone levels, post facto. So, I mean, I don't know. Smarter men maybe.
I've got my own testosterone tragedy, Eugene. Look at this shit. Look at this nightmare right here. All right. So, well, that's it for our show. Hope you enjoyed a little bit of an experiment. We're trying to hone the intrigue concept. Let us know what you think. Subscribe to MMANation.com on YouTube, and more often than not, you'll get cage fighting. And Dallas Winston and Josh, UFC fighter Salmon.
I'll tell you about that guy.
They're going to be on later today. I have a show.
Actually, really, I didn't tell you about that guy. Where's my check?
It's coming. SBN was late in paying him, so it's a trickle down theory, Eugene. Trickle down. All right. Follow us on Twitter at Eugene S. Robinson, at KidNate. Read us on BloodyElbow.com. We'll be posting this on the BloodyElbow.com fan post, where it will be staying for about a week or so. So I would say adios, MMA aficionados, but adios, aficionados of conflict, carnage, corruption, and conspiracy.
Death and despair.
And if you have suggestions for future shows that we can do on Intrigue, I think I want to get Dallas on here and do a review of Goodfellas with the MMA three-way style. More formulated. We'll keep going back to the same topics. All right. Adios, everybody. Thanks.
All right, man. See you later. Bye.